In ancient Sumer, it didn't matter if you were a king, a priestess, or a starving farmer. Death sent every single one of you to the exact same place. No judgment, no paradise, no punishment. Just an eternity of eating dust and drinking from puddles, in a city with no sunlight. That was one of the first afterlives humans ever wrote down, and it's nowhere near the strangest one. Across the ancient world, 5 civilizations built 5 completely different worlds after death. One guarded by a dog, one measured out on a scale, one that turns you into literal government paperwork. Heaven and hell are just the version we grew up with. They were never the only version. And once you see what came before, you'll never think about dying the same way again. Every civilization that has ever existed has had to answer the same impossible question. What happens when we die? And the answer each one chose reveals more about how they actually lived, what they valued, who they feared, what they owed each other, than almost anything else they left behind. So let's start with the civilization that gave the world pyramids, mummies, and one of the most calculated afterlives ever designed. When an ancient Egyptian died, their soul didn't go anywhere immediately. It had to travel through the Duat, a dark underworld full of monsters, fire lakes, and gates that only opened if you knew their secret names. That's why Egyptians were buried with the Book of the Dead. It wasn't a Bible, it was a cheat sheet, literal instructions and spells for getting through the underworld without dying a second time. And a second death was real. At the end of the journey, your heart, not your brain, your heart, because Egyptians believed that's where memory and personality lived, was placed on a golden scale. On the other side sat a single ostrich feather representing Mat, the goddess of truth and order. Anubis watched the scale. 42 judges asked 42 questions about how you'd lived. And if your heart was heavier than that feather, weighed down by every lie, every cruelty, every selfish choice, it was thrown to a creature crouched beside the scale. Amit, part crocodile, part lion, part hippo. She devoured the heart on the spot, and that was it. No hell, no punishment, just nothing. Total erasure. No name, no memory, no soul, which meant the single most important figure in your entire afterlife was, essentially, a cardiologist with a flair for theater and 0 bedside manner. To the Egyptians, that was the actual worst-case scenario. Worse than any fire and brimstone. Not suffering forever, ceasing to exist at all. Pass the test, though, and you didn't ascend to some distant heaven. You crossed into the field of reeds, a mirror image of Egypt itself, with the same Nile, the same fields, the same home you'd always had, except the crops never failed and you never got sick again. Immortality, Egyptian style, wasn't an upgrade. It was just your actual life, minus the parts that hurt. If Egypt's afterlife rewarded how you lived, the Vikings believed something far stranger. How you lived barely mattered at all. What decided your eternity was how you died. Die gloriously in battle, and Valkyries, armored women on winged horses, would descend over the corpses to handpick you personally. Half the slain warriors went to Freya's hall, Folkvanger. The other half went to Valhalla, Odin's own hall, where you'd spend every day fighting to the death for sport. Then, every night, come back to life for a feast that never ran out of mead. Which is, essentially, eternal combat sports with an unlimited bar tab. You were being trained forever for one final battle, Ragnarok, the end of the world, where the gods themselves needed every warrior they could get. But die of old age, or sickness, or anything the Norse considered a boring death. You went to Helheim, a cold, gray realm ruled by a goddess named Hel, who was described as half beautiful woman, half rotting corpse. There was no torture there, just a dim, quiet nothing that Vikings feared more than pain itself, because to a warrior culture, being forgotten was the real punishment. And if the sea took you, you didn't go to Hell or Valhalla at all. You went into the net of Ran, a goddess who dragged drowning sailors down to her underwater hall and kept them there forever, as her collection, somewhere between horrifying and the single greatest use of the word collection in the history of mythology. In Norse belief, your death wasn't the end of your story. It was the sorting mechanism for what came next, and it turned an entire society into people constantly negotiating with their own mortality. The Aztecs pushed that idea even further. In their world, the way you died didn't just decide your fate. It decided which of 13 heavens or 9 underworld levels you'd spend years crossing to reach. Most people, the ones who died of ordinary causes, old age, illness, nothing dramatic, went to Mictlan, the land of the dead, ruled by the skeletal god, Mictlantecuhtli and his wife. Reaching the final resting place took 4 full years, crossing 9 descending levels guarded by monsters, past mountains that crashed together like jaws, through wind sharp enough to cut like obsidian blades. But the hardest crossing came first, right at the start, a wide, churning river called Chiconohapan. No human could swim it alone, so Aztec families buried a small dog beside their dead, a real specific breed, the Xoloitzcuintli, bred and trained for exactly one job, swimming a dead person's soul across that river on its back. No dog, no crossing. If you'd never owned one in life, tradition said you were quite literally stuck at the riverbank forever. Which, if you happened to be a cat person, was extremely bad news. Not everyone made that crossing, though. Warriors who died in battle or as sacrifices, and women who died in childbirth, considered every bit as heroic as any soldier, skipped Mictlan entirely and went straight to Tonatiuh's heaven, escorting the sun across the sky. In Aztec belief, dying badly in the eyes of the gods could still be the best possible death you could ask for. It just depended on which god happened to be watching. But if you want to see what happens when a civilization decides death has nothing good waiting for anyone, not warriors, not the innocent, not even kings, you have to go back further than the Vikings, further than the Aztecs, all the way to Sumer, the civilization that invented writing itself. The Sumerians called it Kur, or Irkala, the Great Below. To get there, a soul passed through 7 gates, and at each one, something was taken. Your clothes, your jewelry, your name, symbolically stripped layer by layer, until you arrived in front of the goddess Ereshkigal completely naked and completely powerless. And what waited on the other side wasn't punishment. It was just less. Souls in Kur ate dust. They drank from puddles. They existed as dim, hungry shadows of who they used to be, with no memory of joy and no hope of anything better. And crucially, it didn't matter who you'd been. Kings ended up exactly like slaves. Heroes ended up exactly like farmers. The great equalizer wasn't death, it was dust, and no amount of gold got you a nicer brand of it. The only thing that helped even slightly was the living remembering to leave food offerings at your grave, which meant your comfort in death depended entirely on whether your family bothered to show up. This is the same underworld that terrifies Gilgamesh, one of the oldest stories ever written, when he watches his best friend die and realizes that exact same gray nothing is waiting for him too. No heaven to earn, no hell to fear. Just an entire civilization that looked directly at death and concluded there was nothing on the other side worth wanting, which is exactly why they spent their whole lives chasing glory in this one. And then there's ancient China, which built an afterlife so specific, so procedural, that it might be the strangest one of all, because it isn't a place, it's a government. In Chinese folk belief, when you die, your soul is processed through Diyu, the underworld, which operates as 10 courts, each one run by its own judge king. Your soul is investigated. Your sins are read out loud from a record that was apparently kept on you your entire life. And punishment is matched precisely to the crime. Corrupt officials boiled in oil, liars sentenced to have their tongues pulled out, gossips forced to have their mouths sewn shut. It sounds like myth, but structurally, it's a courtroom. Appeals, records, sentencing, all of it. Once your sentence is served, you're brought before Meng Po, an old woman who serves every soul a cup of tea that erases all memory of their past life, right before they're sent back to be reincarnated. But here's the twist that makes this afterlife different from every other one on this list. The living never stop participating in it. Families still burn joss paper, folded to look like money, and sometimes shaped into paper houses, paper cars, even paper servants, and send it up in smoke so their ancestors have currency and comfort in the underworld's economy. Somewhere in Chinese belief, right now, in this exact moment, someone is mailing cash to a relative who died decades ago because in that afterlife, money still moves, paperwork still matters, and even death comes with an inbox. Line them up and a pattern shows up that heaven and hell never quite explain. Egypt feared being forgotten. The Norse feared being useless. The Aztecs feared dying for nothing. The Sumerians feared death itself and didn't even try to soften it. China just kept the paperwork running. 5 different fears, 5 completely different worlds built to answer them. Every single one of these civilizations was doing the exact same thing we're doing right now. Guessing. Building a story big enough to make an unanswerable question feel survivable. So the next time someone tells you they know exactly what happens after we die, remember this. For over 5,000 years of recorded history, every civilization on Earth has answered that question with total confidence, and no 2 of them have ever agreed.